Okay, so that worked. Welcome again, everyone. We have a really exciting talk today. Thomas Rossi is here to tell us about his studies on semiconductors. He is a scientist at HBZ Berlin at the Helmholtz Center for Materials and Energy. And we're really excited to hear all you have to tell us, Thomas. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So yeah, let me first thank Jerry and Anne-Marie for giving me the opportunity to present my work today. This is a talk that will focus on pump-probe X-ray absorption spectra. So most of the work that we performed in our group is looking at photophysics in a semiconductor with pump process. So we excite these semiconductors with optical pulses, record X-ray absorption spectra, and try to understand better the physics by doing these experiments. And today, in particular, what I would like to focus on is on these quasi-particles, called excitons, that actually are very present in the X-ray absorption spectra of semiconductors, and try to understand how we can actually manipulate them with light. So my talk is in 3 parts. I have a quite large introduction. It's approximately a third of my talk. I will describe what is excitonics in general and why we need to push it to the X-ray range. Then just a brief reminder of what X-ray absorption spectroscopy is sensitive to, because it has a dual sensitivity to the electronic and lattice structure of materials. Then discuss what is the setup we used to do X-ray absorption spectroscopy and general timescales of photophysics in solids. And part 2 and part 3 will actually be the description of some of our recent experimental results, looking at the photophysics of zinc oxide and a brief outlook on nickel oxide at the end of the talk. So what are excitons, first of all? So excitons are quasi-particles that are formed by the interaction between an electron and a hole, and these 2 particles are coulombically bound together, and there is an energy cost you have to pay to separate them. That's the so-called binding energy of excitons. Excitons are everywhere in nature, but today I will mainly focus on excitons formed in semiconductors. And there is a very easy way to actually form these excitons. It's by shining light on a semiconductor with an energy in the light field that's above the bandgap of the semiconductor. Initially, this will form a bath of electrons and holes. They will not be coulombically bound at the beginning because there is a very efficient screening that takes place between these different charge carriers. But as the time progresses, Coulomb pairs will start to form these excitons, and this is happening really on ultra-fast timescales. So in tens of femtoseconds, you have an exciton population that's formed in your material. To know if a semiconductor you are working on actually has excitonic resonances or not, you can look at, for instance, the optical absorption spectrum. So I'm showing an example here on the right, an optical absorption onset here that's made of a very prominent resonance followed by a continuum of absorption. And the exciton, so the particle I'm talking about here, is the one that forms this prominent resonance here below the bandgap of the semiconductor. So you actually need 2 descriptions to be able to interpret optical absorption in semiconductor. One is based on the continuum of absorption. That's what you get when the photon is absorbed and promote an electron from the top of the valence band to the bottom of the conduction band, but these 2 particles are not coulombically bound together. They are called free carriers. And the excitons, however, forms below the bandgap with an energy that corresponds to the binding energy. So it forms at a lower level than the bandgap by an energy that corresponds to the binding energy of this exciton. And yeah, excitons in the optical range are very popular quasi-particles. It even there is a name to the field that's working on these systems. It's called excitonics. And excitonics actually goes way beyond the simple study of optical excitons. It's actually trying to understand how excitons can be manipulated or they can be used for actual applications. And I would like to show two examples of such manipulation that are recent in the optical range. So one on the left is working on titanium dioxide anatase. It's a pump probe experiment. Anatase also has excitons. And what you see here in this pump probe are these oscillations. And these oscillations are due to an acoustic wave traveling in titanium dioxide. And as it propagates, it's actually modulating both the probability of absorption of an exciton and also its frequency. So beyond being, let's say, an exotic example of how you can control excitons, you should also see what's beyond that, which is that excitons can be sensitive probes of local lattice deformations, for instance. So you can use these excitons for actual applications or to understand better systems you are working on. The example on the right is one on Dyson ZTi solar cells, where excitons are also very useful. This is an experiment where a photon is absorbed by a dye molecule that's attached to the surface of an electron acceptor, in this case, titanium dioxide. When the photon is absorbed, the dye molecule goes to an excited state. And in this excited state, the electron now has a sufficient energy to be injected into the conduction band of titanium dioxide. And when it does so, these new electrons in titanium dioxide, they will actually affect excitonic resonances. And they can affect these excitonic resonances in multiple ways. They can block them, they can frequency shift them. But anyway, whatever is the modification of the excitons that you get, you know that this is an unambiguous proof that electrons have been injected across an interface. And so they can also be used in this respect. So that's essentially about optical excitons. Now we are going to talk about XAS today. So I would like to push these excitons to a slightly higher energy and go to the X-rays. So there are actually also excitons in the X-ray range. They are called core excitons. And the way they differ from the optical ones is that, well, first of all, they are very small. We are talking about excitons that are only a few angstroms in radius here. And also they are element selective. And the reason why they are element selective is simply because these excitons are formed between a hole in a core level and a valence electron, and they're coulombically bound together. The binding energy of these two particles is actually way more than what you get in the optical regime. We are talking about binding energies of typically several hundreds of milli-electron volts in this case. They are extremely small. I, for instance, depicted here a calculated excitonic wave function in zinc oxide, and you can see that there is a special representation of the electronic density in the exciton in yellow, and you can see that the dimensions are typically of the order of interatomic bond distances, so they are way smaller than what an optical exciton is in terms of dimension. And yeah, in case you didn't know, these core excitons are actually very present in the X-ray absorption spectra of many semiconductors. And one way to highlight that they're actually present is by doing calculations that I'm showing here in the top right. So you see an experimental spectrum, the experimental spectrum of zinc oxide at the zinc KH with gray cycles. And we can do two levels of theory on this spectrum. One is called the independent particle approximation, the IPA, where you neglect the formation of core excitons and the Bethe-Salpeter equation in blue, where you actually explicitly account for excitonic interactions. And you can see how excitons actually lead to a much better agreement between experimental data and calculated spectra. So they are indeed present in the X-ray absorption spectrum of many semiconductors. Now, the question I would like to ask today is, these core excitons, can they be used or can they be manipulated? So is there a way to extend the field of excitonics that is already well established in the optical range to the X-ray range? And I think this is important to know because I can think already of multiple applications of these core excitons. For instance, if we can show that core excitons are sensitive to Coulomb interactions, for instance, Coulomb screening, they could be used to study carrier injection at interfaces. So you could think of an experiment where you, for instance, have a perovskite photosensitizing layer, you excite it with a laser, and an electron is injected into the zinc oxide, and now you probe the zinc oxide at the zinc AH, for instance, and something is going to happen to the spectrum of zinc oxide that's directly related to the interaction between these injected carriers and core excitons. And beyond these studies, there is also a wide field of operando studies. I've seen this many times in the literature, people doing experiments where they record X-ray absorption spectra of materials in the dark or under illumination of optical light, compare the two, and they are able to infer that, well, there are carriers being injected at interfaces, or there is a change of density of states, many different things. But our understanding of this experiment, I believe, could be improved if we can better describe how core excitons actually work and how they interact with free charge carriers. So before I move on with my talk, I would just like to do a brief reminder of the sensitivity of X-ray absorption spectroscopy, because I'm going to use this a lot in my talk. I'm showing here a typical X-ray absorption spectrum at a metal KH. So it's, in this case, it's anatized TiO2. The spectrum has multiple sections. There is one part here, very popular, the EXAFS, that's well above the ionization threshold. You have these oscillations that you can Fourier transform to get pair distribution functions, for instance. So this is a part of the spectrum that's uniquely sensitive to the lattice. In the XANES, however, so when you get closer to the ionization threshold, you start to have sensitivity to both the lattice and the charge degrees of freedom. And it makes the interpretation of spectra much more complicated. And in our case, it's also going to be complicated because this is typically where we are going to find core excitons in the material. But although this is very complicated, there is something very nice that we can use in this spectra. It's the fact that we have one part of the spectrum, the EXAFS, that's uniquely sensitive to the lattice. So we can use the information it delivers to try to understand what are the consequences of lattice dynamics on the XANES, and then be able to extract what is the effect of the charges. That's the strategy. And typically, the kind of dynamics we are going to look at in the EXAFS today are lattice heating. I'm going to focus on experiments that are done at the synchrotron, and the time resolution of our experiments is typically of the order of several hundreds of picoseconds. And on these time scales, what you've seen in photoexcited semiconductors is a lot of heat in the lattice that tends to give a very strong signal in the EXAFS. And this is important because at third generation synchrotrons, where we do our experiments, the time resolution we have is typically around here on a logarithmic arrow of time. So we are in the range of several hundreds of picoseconds. So when your X-ray pulse arrives to your sample and records an X-ray absorption spectrum, a lot of things have already taken place in your semiconductor after it has absorbed the optical light. There are typically two processes that happen way, way before the 100 picosecond mark. One process is the carrier-carrier scattering. So all your photoexcited carriers now have thermalized, so they have collided a lot with each other. And because they have collided so many times, they achieve a distribution that can be described by a single temperature. And even on longer time scale, there is the exchange of energy between carriers and phonons by carrier-phonon scattering. And because this also has happened quite a lot before the 100 picosecond mark, now your charge carriers have started transferring energy to the lattice. And by doing so, the lattice heats up. So the state of your system when you actually do the experiment at the 100 picosecond mark is the following. You have photoexcited carriers that are hot and thermalized at a temperature that's higher than the ambient temperature. The lattice is also hot at a temperature that's higher than the ambient temperature. And you can, in good approximation, assume that these two temperatures, the one of the lattice and the one of the carriers, is the same. But the message here is that most of the signal that we actually measure when we do these experiments at synchrotrons actually comes from lattice heating. And the fact that the EXAFs have such a high sensitivity to this effect will actually save us, because we will be able to tell much more than just there is lattice heating in our semiconductor. So the experiment we did is this one. So this is a schematic of the experiment we did. It's actually highlighting two different experiments we did at two different synchrotron facilities. What these two experiments have in common is that we did measurements on zinc oxide thin films. And the zinc oxide thin films are excited by an ultraviolet pump pulse. So there is one experiment where the probe pulse is made of hard X-rays. That's an experiment that was done at the 7IDDN station of the Advanced Photon Source. With these hard X-rays, we are resonant with the zinc KH. The X-rays are monochromatized, focused onto the sample, and the detection of how much the sample absorbs is detected in total fluorescence field with an avalanche photodiode. And we did also another experiment in the soft X-ray range this time. So this is an experiment that was done at BC2 at the UE52 SGM station of BC2. That's literally 100 meters from here. And at this energy, we are resonant with the zinc L3 edge. The X-rays are monochromatized, focused, and this time the measurement is performed in transmission of the zinc oxide thin film. That's much more convenient to do in the soft X-ray range. What I would like to highlight here is that this second experiment in the soft X-ray range is actually something we developed quite recently. And this is an unstation of BESI that's actually open to users. So if you're interested, if you have interesting semiconductors you would like to study with these pump probe techniques, please contact me. I would be happy to help you writing proposals and also to do the experiment. And so with this, I will finish my introduction by just showing how experimental data are actually depicted. So what we record are X-ray absorption spectra of semiconductors in two different sets of conditions. One is when the sample is not excited by the optical laser. This is the so-called equilibrium state that's highlighted in blue. And we also record one spectrum when the sample is excited by the optical laser. That's the excited state highlighted in red. And usually the differences between these two spectra are quite small. So the way we depict experimental data are by looking at experimental transients, these black cycles here that are essentially the difference between the red and the blue XAS spectra. So we prefer to highlight what are the differences when the sample is excited or unexcited by the pump laser. Positive signals mean that the sample absorbs more when it's optically excited, and negative signals mean that the sample absorbs less. And so with this, it's the end of my introduction. And if you have questions about the experimental setup, now would be probably a good time to ask those.
Thanks very much, Toma. So we don't have any questions yet in the chat, but if anyone wants to just unmute and ask something, you are welcome to. This has been a very nice introduction so far, Toma. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so I guess I move on.
It looks like you can go ahead. Okay.
So I will talk about the experimental results then.
Sorry. Toma, sorry.
Yeah.
We do have a question. Okay, so Cameron, you are welcome to just ask your question yourself if you would like.
Yeah, I was just wondering what the setup was for the solid films. I'm not sure. I might have missed that part. I mean, on the last slide, maybe.
Can you please ask again? I did not hear you really well.
Oh, I was wondering what your setup was for the solid films, for your zinc oxide films.
You're asking about the thickness?
Oh, no, the setup.
The setup. Okay. And sorry, what about the setup? It's breaking a little bit.
I was just wondering how you like mounted the sample. Is the sample like temperature controlled? I know you mentioned how thermalizing is a pretty important factor. So I was just wondering if you could talk more about that.
Sorry, is it me or it's breaking up so much? I cannot
so
hear the question.
maybe I can help, Toma.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Cameron's asking about like how the setup, how your solid film is mounted, and you mentioned, you know, heating is an issue. So is it temperature controlled, or is there some way to manage the heat?
Yeah.
He's
So
asking about
okay,
that.
great. So two answers because these are two different experiments. So for the experiment that's in the hard X-ray range, the setup, the sample is in air, and we are blowing nitrogen on it while we are measuring. And the experiment was done at a sufficiently low repetition rate that the lattice heating can recover between two consecutive pulses. For the experiment that's done in the soft X-ray range, this experiment is under vacuum. And that's a big problem because the heat has nowhere to go under vacuum, essentially. So what we did then is that we embedded the sample into a gas cell to try to mimic the conditions we have when we do the hard X-ray range. So the sample is inside a gas cell. There is helium constantly flowing on it to allow X-rays to be transmitted through the thin film, and this also helps the sample to thermalize, to cool down between two consecutive laser pulses. I hope this addresses the question.
Yeah, that was great. That was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Tomo, we have another question. Okay, Prahlad. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Would you like to just go ahead and ask, or would you like me to ask?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and ask.
Go-
Yeah, Thomas. So the laser excitation spot size, I guess, does that need to be matched with the X-ray beam width, because X-ray spectra is gonna be averaged over all the atoms where the beam is hitting the sample, right? So how did you handle that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so there are two things you need to do. The first one is indeed, as you said, you need to make actually the footprint of the laser on the sample larger than the dimension of the footprint of the X-rays. That's typically something we do in probe experiments, such that you can probe only an excited volume of your sample. So you only see a part of the sample that has been excited by the laser pulse. But this is not sufficient because you also need to worry about the penetration depths of your films. And for the X-ray range, actually for both experiments, we match the thickness of the thin film with the penetration depths of the pump laser, so that also in the depth direction, you only probe atoms that have been excited by the laser pulse.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. And so if there are no other questions.
It looks like we're good. You please go ahead, Toma.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm showing here how raw data typically look like. So two experiments, one at the zinc K edge and one at the zinc L3 edge. We did the measurements at multiple fluences because we try to understand what is the scaling of the effect we are observing here with the amount of carriers that we have generated in our semiconductor. And the strategy to interpret this spectra is always starting from the EXAFS. And the reason for that is because of this unique sensitivity to the structure that I described before. It would be way more complicated to look at the XANES first because it is sensitive to 2 different degrees of freedom. So I will focus on the zinc edge and try to convince you that it's actually pretty simple to understand what's happening in the EXAFS. So the pump probe signal essentially looks like a mirror image of the equilibrium spectrum that's represented in gray. So you can try to flip this spectra along a normalized line. You would see that they match pretty well. And the message that this is telling us, like immediately we know that what we are looking at is lattice heating, and that it's very dominant in the EXAFS. And the reason why it looks like this, like a mirror image, is because lattice heating, what it does is it basically increases the incoherent motion of the atoms in your system. And by doing so, it's basically destroying the coherences of X-aff oscillations. There is a parameter that's quantifying this that's called the Debye-Waller factor. The Debye-Waller factor is basically simply a measurement of this mean square displacement of the atoms around the equilibrium position. And we can use this pump probe in the X-affs and actually be able to tell by how much the lattice heats up. We have done this with two different techniques. One is by doing complementary X-ray absorption spectroscopy measurements, where we put the thin film on a heating stage and simply record X-ray absorption spectra at multiple lattice temperatures. This gives us a database. And from this database, we are able to simulate what should be the pump probe signal associated with a lattice when it heats up by a specific amount. So we can do a chi-square minimization, for instance, and try to find what is the best agreement between this database and our experimental pump probe data. And in this case, we found out that the lattice heats up by 60 Celsius. There is another method that we can use that relies on ab initio calculation this time. So we did a calculation in the full multiple scattering approach using the FDM-NES code, where we also build a database by simply calculating many spectra when the Debye-Waller factor of the material is increased. And again, by doing a chi-square minimization, we find what is the best agreement with the experiment. So this delivers to us by how much the Debye-Waller factor increases when the lattice gets hot. So overall, the physics is not super interesting, right? So it's a lot of lattice heating on these timescales, 100 picoseconds. But although it doesn't look very interesting, it turns out to be absolutely crucial for the interpretation of the data. Because if lattice heating is actually contributing a lot to the X-affs, it's also contributing a lot to the XANEs. And the way we highlight this is by using the information we have just extracted, that lattice heating is the dominant contribution to the X-affs, and we report this information into the XANEs. And what we can see is that when we compare the contribution from lattice heating, that's highlighted in red, and the pump probe data, that's the black line, we can see that there is a systematic difference now between these two curves in the XANEs. And the difference between these two curves is what is highlighted in blue. And this is what we call a non-thermal contribution to the XANEs. We can discuss maybe later on what is the validity of splitting the pump probe signal into different contributions, but this is essentially how we analyze it. And it turns out that this non-thermal contribution is the electronic information that we are looking for. And the only way to access it is by first doing this work of trying to isolate what are the thermal contributions to the pump probe data first. So I hope this is convincing enough that, yeah, lattice heating is absolutely crucial and it needs to be accounted for. And so in the following part of the talk, I will only focus on this non-thermal contribution to the pump probe data. That's the interesting part for us that I want to tell today. So I've reported this non-thermal pump probe signal here with these shaded curves that correspond to different excitation fluences of the laser. You can see that this signal increases as the pump fluence increases. And when we look at this line shape and we compare it with the equilibrium spectrum in gray, what we notice is that it seems, well, this looks pretty much like a first derivative line shape. So you have two negative features followed by two positive features. So it looks like these non-thermal transients actually correspond to the spectrum moving to the right. It's blue shifting. And a qualitative way to show that is by actually doing the simulation. So I have taken this experimental XAS spectrum, shifted it to the right by different amounts, and this gives me the colored cycles that you see here that qualitatively reproduce what is observed in the pump probe experiment. So we can conclude from this that there is a blue shift of the X-absorption spectrum in the photoexcited state. And in the next, I will try to interpret where this blue shift comes from. But keep in mind from where we started, so this was our raw data that has both lattice heating and non-thermal contributions in it. and look at where we end up to be able to tell that there is something non-thermal happening in the sample. So we are going to interpret where this blue shift comes from. And for that, I needed the help of my theory colleagues. So I have a collaboration with the SOL group at Humboldt University. It's the group of Professor Claudia Draxel. The people who did the person who did the calculation is Dr. Lu Qiao. And what she did for us is she simulated a pump probe experiment using a code that's able to include excitons in the calculation. So what she tried to reproduce is the effect of the pump pulse that's promoting carriers between the valence band and the conduction band, and the effect it has on the X-ray absorption, basically. And so the way the calculation is done is you always start from a DFT calculation. The DFT calculation gives you the electronic structure of the ground state of your material. Then once you have the DFT completed, you can run a Bethe-Salpeter equation calculation on top of it. That's the calculation that will deliver the ground state X-ray absorption spectrum that is measured experimentally. And then you want to do another batch of calculations where now you want to account for the effect of the pump excitations. And there are essentially two ways of doing this, depending on the time scale at which you do the experiment. One is on the picosecond. So on the picosecond, remember that your carriers have cooled down. They set up in a Fermi-Dirac distribution, for instance, with only a temperature that is much higher than the ambient temperature. So what you can do in principle to model this specific excited state is that you can manually promote carriers between the valence band and the conduction band. So you manually promote these carriers and you set them according to a Fermi-Dirac distribution. This is called constrained DFT. And it's one way to calculate the electronic structure of an excited state. So that's what Lu did to simulate the results of picosecond experiments. And once you have the electronic structure of this excited state, you can run a Bethe-Salpeter equation on top of it that delivers the excited state, X-ray absorption spectrum. And now you have all the tools that you need to be able to reproduce the experimental data, because the pump probe is simply the difference between the excited state and the ground state that delivers what we call the X-ray transient absorption. So it's the pump probe difference spectrum, essentially. And the novelty in this work is that we were able, with this exciting code, to disentangle many-body contributions to the pump probe spectrum. And in particular, there are two many-body contributions that are extremely important. One is the Pauli blocking. The Pauli blocking is the effect of carrier populations on blocking X-ray transitions. So it's basically based on the Pauli exclusion principle, although there is some contributions from the exchange interaction in it as well. And the other one is the Coulomb screening. So the fact that the photoexcited carriers, they actually bring a Coulomb field with them, and this Coulomb field is going to screen excitonic interactions. So that's basically the theoretical framework we used. And the results of the calculations are these ones. So I want to send a universal message here. So I put the zinc A edge and the zinc L3 edge results side by side. In the top panel, you can see how well the theory does to reproduce equilibrium spectra, theory with the continuous black curve, experiment with the gray dash curves. In the panel below, this is the result of the constrained DFT. So we are manually exciting a given density of excited carriers, and we observe what effect it has on the X-ray absorption spectrum. And that's what is very exciting here is that we are able to reproduce the blue shift that we observed in the experimental data that looks pretty much like a rigid shift to the right. And the bottom panel is the simulation of the pump probe, again, with theory in continuous curve and experiment with shaded curves. And you can see that we can get a great agreement between experiment and theory, both at the zinc A edge and at the zinc L3 edge. And if instead of using this code that includes excitonic interactions, you use the independent particle approximation that does not include excitonic interactions, what you get are the dashed curves. So you can see that it's completely missing what's happening experimentally. So the inclusion of co-excitons are actually crucial to be able to interpret what's going on here. And now remember that we can dig even further into what is the origin of this signal. And by splitting the different contributions to the signal, so there is this Coulomb screening and the Pauli blocking. And Lou, what she found is that the dominant contribution to what you observe is a Coulomb screening contribution. So the origin of this pump probe signal is that the photoexcited carriers that you have generated with your pump pulse, they actually screen the core exciton and they reduce their binding energy. That's what explains the blue shift of these excitons. And not only can we blue shift these excitons, but we can also blue shift them by different amounts, depending on the excitation density you use to excite the zinc oxide thin film. And this is what we needed to, let's say, start the field of X-ray excitonics, because this is essentially one way to manipulate them. So I put a figure here how this is actually working, that we have a pump pulse that excites carriers between two bands, the valence band and the conduction band. And the effect it has on the X-ray absorption spectrum is really to just renormalize the binding energy of core excitons, leading to a blue shift. So this is very nice, and I think it's kind of a novel idea and should be in principle happening in any semiconductor material in the excited state, basically. And it should be used to actually infer the presence of excited carriers in semiconductors, for instance. And yeah, I think this is a good time for a second break.
All right, thank you, Toma. Tyler, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. Toma, hi, how's it going?
Hi.
Is the subtraction of the thermal contribution affected by the blue shift? Like, do you need to, shift your thermal contribution appropriately?
No, you don't need to. So this actually brings me to the discussion of the validity of this splitting of signals between a thermal and a non-thermal contribution. So we believe that this approximation that we have made of splitting this into two contributions becomes less and less valid as you go to softer edges. And the reason for this is because we are observing core excitons. So these are very small particles. And we think that they couple very little to the atomic motion. So when you are dealing with core excitons, if there is lattice heating taking place, they are barely affected by that if it's an exciton at the K edge of a transition metal, for instance. However, as you go to shallower and shallower edges, the radius of your exciton starts to become larger and larger. And we expect that this now starts to become more affected by all this incoherent thermal motion that you have in your system. So this approach should be less and less valid. And in fact, we did observe that at the zinc L3 edge, this splitting into two contributions was not as good as what we observed at the zinc K edge. Basically, I hope this addresses the question. So no shift when we remove thermal signals. It's a pure subtraction.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Gilles, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Thomas. Maybe to follow up on that, what would you expect for this question of separation between the two the different contributions if you had to focus on the femtosecond range?
Okay, so the femtosecond actually is a very challenging time scale. So you mean also time-wise?
Yeah,
is it possible to also split on femtosecond time scales?
Yeah, let's say you do an experiment in an X-FEL. Whether it's interesting or not for your questions, I don't know, but
yeah.
What could you do this separation? What's your feeling?
So my feeling is that the approximation is also going to break down at some point, and I believe that this has to do with the amount of screening that you generate. So if you go to extremely high carrier densities, which is typically what you achieve on femtosecond timescale, the core exciton is so screened that now its radius starts to increase also a lot because of the screening. So you are essentially reducing the binding energy between the core hole and the valence electrons. And also this increase of radius of the core exciton has an influence, because I suspect that it breaks the validity of the splitting. But now I'm also thinking that on the femtosecond timescale, the lattice heating is much less of a problem because it doesn't have time to take place in principle. So you may not have to deal with it if your experiment is fast enough. That would be my suspicion. Now, if you're talking about, like, let's say 1 picosecond where the two contributions may be present, I would say it's very difficult and the approximation may break down. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
I have a quick kind of follow-up question. Thomas, you mentioned that the ability to separate cleanly starts to break down when you go to soft X-rays and you're dealing with more like higher level orbitals. And you indicated that you saw this. So what was the indication to you that it?
It's simply because the theory agrees less with the experiment. So that's so I find the calculations on the left to more convincingly reproduce experimental data than the one on the right at the zinc L3 edge, and this is basically how I explained it. That I believe that this has to do with the radius of the exciton increasing and coupling more and more strongly with the lattice heating, so that these two contributions are not independent anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any more questions at this moment? It looks like no. So Thomas, please go ahead.
Yeah. So then what comes is essentially a summary of what we have found on zinc oxide. With I will only briefly describe what more we found out on this system, not to go too much into the detail. But the take-home message first is that, remember from where we started and where we ended, lattice heating is extremely important for these picosecond experiments. It should be dealt with to be able to interpret experimental data. And I think this is key for the future of picosecond experiments on semiconductors. Then the other thing is we found out this core exciton screening. And we believe that this could be one way to manipulate core excitons, although on the picosecond timescale, it's quite limited, because what you do is you're basically shifting all these excitonic resonances by the same amount in the same direction. So you are basically modulating your entire spectrum. It's not like you are able to really individually control individual, it's not like you're able to control individual excitonic resonances, basically. But it's still, I think, one contribution to the field of excitonics. Then the other thing is we found out a nonlinearity in the signal. So the amount of blue shift you get actually saturates as you increase the excitation density. And we found out that the reason why there is this saturation is because of not only do you need to account for carrier densities in your simulations, but you also need to account for carrier distributions. This is very nicely illustrated here by the theory where you fix the excitation density of your system, and you perform calculations by putting carriers further and further away from the high symmetry points. So here you populate 1K point, 3K points, and 5K points in reciprocal space, but the carrier density remains the same between the three simulations. And when you simulate the pump probe signal that's associated to that, what you find out is that there is a saturation of the amplitude of the signal. So it's when you put carriers further and further away from the high symmetry point, the pump probe signal that's associated to that is slightly less. And what this shows is that carriers that are actually further away from the high symmetry point, they comparatively contribute less to the Coulomb screening of core excitons than the ones that are at the high symmetry points. So this gives birth to this non-linearity. So the Coulomb screening is not only sensitive to the density of charge carriers, but it's also sensitive to their distribution in K-space. And the final thing is that my colleague was able to simulate what would be the result of an XFEL experiment. So this time, instead of using the constrained DFT, she used a real-time TD-DFT and then ran the Bethe-Salpeter equation on it. And that's typically what you would get on a time scale of 20 femtoseconds at increasing fluences. And now what you can see is that the line shape becomes quite dependent on the density of carriers that you put in your system as you increase the fluence. So for instance, there is a large change of relative amplitude between the features. And what this indicates is that individual excitonic resonances start to shift by different amounts. And by doing so, this is one way to actually individually control them. So I think there are great promises by doing experiments on femtosecond timescale if we want to achieve an even higher control over these core exciton resonances. And I've in mind how we could actually use these core excitons in an experiment, typically for the one that I talked about at the beginning. Now that we know that free charge carriers actually have an influence on these core excitons, we could definitely think about an experiment where we pump a perovskite layer with a laser field. This perovskite will inject electrons into the zinc oxide, and we probe, for instance, the zinc oxide at the zinc K edge, and we know that the core excitons in the zinc oxide will feel the presence of these injected carriers because they will screen the core excitons. So this is an unambiguous proof that charge carriers have been injected at the interface, basically. And that ends up the zinc oxide part. And with the remaining time, I would like to discuss some of other results that we got on nickel oxide, still a pump probe absorption spectroscopy experiment. So nickel oxide is a very exciting material both for theoreticians and experimentalists. It is a strongly correlated material. What this means is that the physics of the system is actually very frozen. So the fact that you have electrons in the 3D orbitals of nickel tends to make the conduction of the system very small. So what I'm depicting here is the typical density of state of nickel oxide. The Fermi level is here. You have the valence band that is made of the p orbitals of oxygen, and the conduction band that is made of unoccupied 3D orbitals of nickel. And that's where light absorbs. This is called the charge transfer gap. It's typically of the order of 4 electron volts in nickel oxide. And now the consequence of the what we call the electronic correlation, so the repulsion that takes place between electrons when they have opposite spin in the same 3D orbital, is to split the 3D density of states into 2 bands. The 2 bands that are highlighted here in gray. One is called the lower Hubbard band, and the upper one is the upper Hubbard band. And the energy difference between these two is what we call the correlation gap. And the correlation gap is essentially the energy you have to pay to put 2 3D electrons in the same orbital with opposite spin. And in nickel oxide, this energy cost is of the order of 6 to 7 electron volts. And the motivation here is that there have been recent examples that by shining ultraviolet light on nickel oxide, it is possible to renormalize the electronic correlations. And when this happens, the upper Hubbard band and the lower Hubbard band get closer to each other by some amount. And by doing so, the optical gap is also renormalizing. And this has great applications in optoelectronics, for instance. The problem is that it would be interesting to know for how long this renormalization of the correlation gap can live. Especially for applications, you would like this renormalization to live for at least hundreds of picoseconds such that it can become usable. And this is typically why we did the pump probe X-ray absorption spectroscopy experiment on nickel oxide at the nickel KH to see if we can capture this renormalization of electronic correlations and for how long it lives. So the experiment we did was some time ago already. This was at the Swiss light source. We worked on microcrystals of nickel oxide. Those were suspended in water. It was actually quite difficult to suspend them. You can see some foam here that's generated by the tensioactive molecule that we put in the solution to be able to suspend the microcrystals. And we excite the nickel oxide with a pump of 3.5 electron volts, and we probe the system at the nickel KH. And the results we got should not be surprising to you that with the 200 picosecond time resolution that we had during this experiment, what we observed in the EXAFS is a lot of lattice heating again. But this time, because the crystals were not thin films, but actually particles, we were able to quantify by how much the Debye-Waller factor and how much the lattice parameter changes in the excited state. So we get this great plot of a minimization of a chi-square to actually establish how the lattice parameter changes and how much the Debye-Waller factor changes with ab initio calculations. And we were also able to reproduce the pump probe by these complementary measurements of lattice heating. And you can find out that, for instance, in this case, a lattice heated up by 35 Celsius actually reproduced really well the signal you see in the EXAFS. And we use this information again in the XANES. So starting from the EXAFS, going into the XANES, we can take the difference between the pump probe data and the simulation from lattice heating. And the difference we get is the black curve. That is noisy, but there is a little bit of a signal that you can see with some positive signal here at the rising edge and some negative signal here at the white line. And when we try to explain what was the origin of this non-thermal signal, we first did simulations of the core exciton screening similar to the ones that we did for the zinc oxide, found out that it was not agreeing very well with the experimental data. But when we did the simulations with by renormalizing the correlation gap instead by 50 millielectron volts, that's the red shaded curve. I actually have to apologize that I got corrupted data before this talk, so I'm only able to show you an unconvoluted pump probe signal. So it should in principle be broadened by the experimental resolution, but I think it's still pretty convincing that the renormalization of the correlation gap actually does reproduce positive signals at the rising edge and the negative signal that you see at the white line. And on top of that, this 50 millielectron volts renormalization of the electronic correlations is what has been observed by others in recent experiments that were done at the XFEL. So overall, the message is that using this pump probe spectroscopy, we are able to see a renormalization of electronic correlations. And these correlations are actually long-lived, which is the question that we tried to address at the beginning. For how long can we actually use them for actual applications? So they can live for at least 200 picoseconds, and the kinetics indicates that they live for at least several hundreds of picoseconds before they recover. And that was basically an outlook. So now I would like to conclude. So whatever is the experiment you have the most interest in, the zinc oxide or the nickel oxide, what these two experiments have in common is that when you do these pump probe measurements at synchrotrons, most of what you see is actually lattice heating. But once you have accounted for this effect, then what remains, that is the non-thermal part of the signal, is actually very interesting. So the core exciton screening that we highlighted in zinc oxide and the renormalization of electronic correlations in nickel oxide. And so with this, I would like to thank, so this is a big group of people to do these two experiments in different countries with also industrial partners. I would like to thank everyone and the funding sources to be able to do these exciting experiments. And so with this, I think I'm at the hour mark, so it's a pretty good time to stop. Thank you all for attending my talk, and would like to answer a last round of questions.
Thanks very much, Thomas. This is really excellent. Dugan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there any evidence of seeing screening of core excitons by other core excitons, like in a steady state XAS experiment at extremely high X-ray fluences, or the core excitons just far too small for that to ever be possible?
So this is a great question, and it's exactly what my first slides were talking about. Is I think now is a good time to look into the operando studies. So people basically shining just continuous light on materials, trying to capture differences in materials, and try to see if there is evidence of coexciton screening by also doing these measurements. Now, the big difference is that here we are talking about excitation densities that will probably be much smaller than the ones that we see in these pump probe experiments. But I suspect that if you measure for a sufficiently long time, this should still be possible. So that's for just the static part. Then if you're talking about coexciton screening at, let's say, even other edges, so I think it's quite well established at the M edge of several semiconductors, although people have not called this coexciton screening. I think they give it a different name.
So I was more wondering, like, if you'd expect to see core excitons screening other core excitons. So no optical excitation, no bandgap excitation.
Sorry. So actually, this question is also a great question, and I think an XFEL experiment needs to be done on this. So what you're asking is actually an experiment that would be an XFEL pump, XFEL probe experiment, so that you can generate a bath of coexcitons and see how they are able to screen each other. And to my knowledge, this has not been done. Would be very interesting to do, though.
Okay, thank you.
Tyler has a question.
Thomas, do you have to do basically a separate experiment for the thermal measurements always?
Every time.
Okay.
That's you have to deal with that. So when you ask for it's the unfortunate truth. You have to do it every time, and because you get 1 week of beam time, you have to account for the time that you will need like a day to measure, to record all these temperature dependent spectra, but you need them for the data interpretation.
How does that work at the L edge?
Yes, so at the L edge, what we have is, so the sample is in a gas cell, as I described earlier. So there are actually thermal contacts on the substrate, so you can actually heat it up this way. So it's like on some copper conducting surface, and you can heat up your sample this way, and you measure in transmission. Yeah.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat from Tim. Tim, would you like to go ahead and ask?
Hi there, Thomas. Thanks for a very interesting talk. As we all know, zinc oxide is a particularly complex material. So do the effects of non-stoichiometry, morphological effects, or trace contaminants have any effect on the signal theory? Or by the methods that you're using here, are they essentially sort of subtracted out from the data as you go along?
Yeah, so this is also an excellent question, and so it does, in my opinion, it doesn't have an influence on the shape of the signal. However, it does have a big influence on how long it takes for the signal to recover. So typically this screening of core excitons, you still need the carriers to be free for this to take place, the one that you generate with your pulse. If you have a material that's very highly defective, it's going to trap a significant amount of these excited carriers. They are not contributing to the screening anymore. So the effect is still there, but it's much weaker and decaying much more quickly than what you would get from an experiment in a single crystal or a thin film.
So if you sort of specifically trying to look at that effect at all, or is that just another level challenging experiment?
No, we have not done this. Actually, there are, if you look at the literature, there are quite a few pump probe SAS experiments on zinc oxide nanoparticles. There are a couple at least.
Yep.
And you can look into it. The interpretation is actually different there. So they actually do talk about trapping of charge carriers. So it may actually influence, I suspect, quite a lot if you go to very defective systems.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question from Cameron. Cameron, please go ahead.
Okay, hi. Is my mic better now?
Yeah.
Okay. I kind of have two questions that build off on each other. I was wondering how big your nickel oxide nanoparticles were. And then I was wondering if you have any quantification of how many excitons you're producing per pump of these nickel oxide nanoparticles.
Okay, so the first question, the nickel oxide particles have typically a diameter of a micron. So these are micro. This is why I insisted on the fact that these are microcrystals in suspension. Okay. So they really have a bulk structure. And we had to tune the pump wavelengths to actually just the onset of the charge transfer gap, because otherwise the penetration depth was not deep enough, and we were getting mismatch between pump and probe penetration depths. Then, so you're asking a very interesting question for the zinc oxide. So for the experiment that I've shown here, the pump actually generates quite a lot of carriers, the pump, and this is typically above the mode density. So being above the mode density, this means that the optical excitons cannot form in zinc oxide. You actually do keep something that is pretty plasma-like, let's say. And then this is interacting with your core excitons that you generate with your probe pulse. Does that address your question?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So yeah, it's in a specific electronic state. And actually, I would like to extend a little bit on that at the APS, we did a measurement by tuning the pump to below the mode density. It took us 24 hours to average a signal there, but we still managed to measure it, and we were able to see a signal that actually differs quite significantly. Actually, I probably have this here. Just 1 second. It's this one. So the red cycles is the 24-hour measurement that's below the mode density. The gray curve is a measurement that's above the mode density. You can see that they differ quite a lot, especially in this rising Xane's edge. And the main difference is that we can start to see a positive signal below the edge that corresponds to where the top of the valence band is supposed to be, and an additional negative signal here where the bottom of the conduction band is supposed to be. So now we start to see the Pauli blocking that's negligible when you do the experiment above the mode density. The problem is I think there are like plenty of more suitable techniques to look at the Pauli blocking than pump probe SAS, but still here you are observing typically a signal that displays both the Coulomb screening and the Pauli blocking with nearly equivalent amplitudes.
Okay, yes. Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Any other questions from anyone? We've gone a little over time. I apologize to everyone for that, but this has been super interesting. Thank you so much, Toma. Your measurements are it's just excellent, and I really appreciate the careful treatment of the thermal effects. This is so so important.
It's the take-home message.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope to see you all next month.
Thank you,
again.
everyone.